Are climates really changing, or is this narrative the greatest hoax perpetrated against the American taxpayer? Who is the benefactor of climate change policies? Is it the American people, the scientific community, corporations who increase prices on so-called climate-safe, all-natural products, or is it the politicians? We're going to examine the actual science behind climate change to see if this is real or a hoax. Tonight, on this episode of The First Branch. There were a lot of accusations I threw out there in the intro to this episode, and I'm comfortable with throwing them out there. The reason I'm comfortable with those accusations is because I'm beginning this journey of discovery from the point of view of a believer. I was once someone who did believe that the climates were changing. You'll notice I said was a believer. So how does someone go from believing in science to being a skeptic? First, what I want to say, and I'm going to be very direct when I say this, and I'm not saying it to be mean, but to assure that there is no misunderstanding of my position on climate change. I am not a skeptic. I flat out reject the idea of climates changing. But don't go shutting me down just yet. Remember, I once had the courage to listen to those who think it's real. So take some time to have the courage to hear an opposing view. Anyway, the truth is always better than fiction, right? So how did I go from someone who believed in science to someone who doesn't? Well, to start with, I didn't go from believing in science to then not believing in science. I let the science dictate my belief. Yes, you heard that right. The science I let speak for itself. I did not force the science into my belief. What is stranger than that is how all this came about in the first place. And why that is so strange is I wasn't looking for an opposing view on this topic. I was already convinced it was real. It was actually discussing it from the point of a believer I began to see glaring holes in the science. Not small little holes like, oh, we'll figure that out in the future sort of hole. I mean like, wait a minute. They just ignored large portions of scientific understanding of ecological succession. And that is very significant from a scientific point of view. But that would not be where my journey actually began. But along the way, the journey did eventually lead to seeing this, as well as many other omissions, to the more established sciences of ecology, geology, habitat development, and of course the relationship between these things, these three. Why I was a believer in the first place is very simple. As a pilot, I have studied weather very seriously. Understanding frontal zones and how to interpret the activities of weather patterns can affect the outcome of the safety of flight. As someone who flies my own family in our own airplane, I take their safety very seriously. So the same organizations that I trust to provide me with an accurate weather picture are the same organizations that were also broadcasting the information concerning climate change and its impact on our environment. So if I'm trusting them with one, I could naturally trust them with the other. Or at least so I thought. And just through the natural course of conversation with other like-minded pilots, some inconsistencies were starting to show. So I began to listen to all the pro-climate change scientists. I would watch them on the major cable news networks and then talk with my fellow climate changers on the topics these scientists were discussing. One of the podcasts that stood out to me, that convinced me that climate change was real, was on an episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, where he was interviewing Candace Owen, and she was clearly out of her element when it came to her understanding of climate change. So after watching her failed understanding of the science of climate change, I was more convinced than ever that climate change was real. I came to the conclusion that those on the right, and again, I'm a conservative, were just against it because the left was for it. But something began to happen as I began to read documents and watch debates on the news. I began to see the first cracks in the scientists' presentation. I'll get to what those cracks were in just a few moments. But once I saw it, I didn't just throw my hands up and jump to the other side of the aisle. I wanted to see if others were seeing what I was seeing. So I began to just casually ask my fellow climate changers two very basic questions. Questions I felt that as a climate change believer, I should be able to answer. And I couldn't. What was more important was I wasn't hearing the answer from the scientific community either. So I just began asking these two very basic questions. And I'm going to ask them of you here, the audience, tonight. And be honest with your answers. If you're not, the only person you're deceiving is yourself. Because we are going to get to the scientific truth of climate change here tonight. And the first question is this: how many climates are there, and what are they? Not one person I asked out of more than 100 like-minded climate changers could answer that question. I mean, if I believe climates are changing, shouldn't I know what they are? And the second question being, what are they changing to? Not only was I not bothered by the fact that I did not know the answer, but what troubled me more was why I didn't know. I mean, I had poured hundreds of hours into watching debates and reading literature on climate change. Why couldn't I tell you what the climates were? I had all of the other arguments memorized. Why not this information? This was the first crack I saw. And it was not small. Science is based on observation. So why were scientists not letting us in on what those observations were? I know many of you are going to say, Michael, these are questions that only a child would ask. Well, I'm going to share with you Neil deGrasse Tyson's thoughts on this very viewpoint. He himself said, kids asking, why do I have fingernails? Why do I see orange when the sun sets? Why does my nose run? These inquisitive natures that a child has is the essence of scientific discovery. He encourages these type of questions because it's these questions that lead to discovery and knowledge. So with that in mind, I set out to discover the truth about what science says about climate change, because scientists have failed to share the most basic observations of climate change with me. What are the climates, and what are they changing to? So I began my journey by answering those two questions. And right from the get-go, bam, I saw a contradiction. Well, strike that. It wasn't a contradiction. It was more of an inconsistency than a contradiction. But right off the bat, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration lists 5 major climates, with Sciencing.com listing 6. A few more sites list 8, and a dozen more sites have it between 10 and 13 climates. So what started out as a hopeful journey of discovery had turned into a desire to prove I hadn't been duped by the people I had trusted my entire adult life. So it's no wonder scientists had been hesitant to discuss this topic. They can't even agree on what the climates are, much less what they're changing to. This led me to the next natural step in the questioning of my own belief in climate change. What makes a climate? If I understood what makes one, then I can understand why they're changing. And again, no scientist telling me to believe in climate change was talking about this topic either. One has to ask themselves why. I began to study this question by looking at the micro and then up to the macro. And the reason I worked this way was because of the way the information was being presented. Scientists led all of their discussions from the point of view of human interference, how we as humans are behaving that is causing the negative effects in our environment. So I wanted to understand how environments are made, maintained, and affected to the point of change. What amazed me was how susceptible our environments are to change, yet how resilient they can be. It almost seems like a contradiction, but it's not. It highlights the amazing relationship between the entities that make up habitats, ecosystems, and climates. So let's begin with the ecosystem. It is here, at this level of environmental behavior, biological organisms have the greatest impact on their surroundings. So what is an ecosystem? Simply put, it is a biological community of interacting organisms and their environment. There are 2 prevailing factors that affect the function of an ecosystem. They are population density and carrying capacity. Now, there are several factors that affect population density, such as reproductive rates and even genetic mutations. And no, I'm not just talking about human species. This pertains to all biological organisms based on the principles of taxonomy. The carrying capacity affecting survivability, migrations, as well as hibernation. These factors being based on what habitats provide by way of plants and animals through the life cycle process. In understanding the relationship between biological organisms and their environment, as well as their limit on the impact of their ecosystem, provides the first two major discoveries as for why I know climate change is not based on real science. The observable, repeatable, and measurable evidence lies in the history of the stability of a biome, even though an ecosystem may change or a completely new one may develop in a limited geographical area. And notice I said limited. I'm going to show you just how limited we are in the effects we can have on a given localized geographic area. Then I'm even going to provide evidence of when we impact levels of a geographic area in a catastrophic manner, the resiliency of our climates to resist any change. So let's dive into how ecosystems are made. There are only two ways: primary succession and secondary succession. The first being the development of a completely new ecosystem. This is not proof of evolution. Why? Because microorganisms are already present and just need a catalyst to get the biological development process started. An example of the primary succession is when a new island is formed out of volcanic activity. The lava rises above sea levels and the organisms begin to respond to the exposure to the atmosphere. An entirely new ecosystem is formed. What is important to note is that the climate does not change, ever. Even though a whole new island has sprung up, the climate surrounding the island remains the same every single time. Not once in the history of ever has a new ecosystem developed and it changed the climate around it. And I'm going to prove to you why this is an observable truth. Secondary succession is when a previous ecosystem is overtaken by another. Now, there are thousands of reasons why this happens, and we have several modern observable and several meaning repeatable and repeatable meaning measurable examples of just how stable our climates actually are, even when an ecosystem has been completely changed. The example I'm going to share with you here tonight, I share with you because of its recency in history, the scope of the change to the ecosystem itself, and the lack of impact on the climate of that region. And it is the example of the Diamond Crystal Salt Mine disaster, when on November 20th, 1980, an oil rig operated by Texaco was doing some exploratory drilling in Lake Peigneur in Louisiana, which also happened to be on top of that salt mine. The rig broke through the top of the mine and the lake drained into that mine. The draining of that lake caused the Del Combre Canal's flow to reverse, and over the next 3 to 5 days, salt water flowed into that empty lake bed, flooding the area with salt water. What was once a freshwater lake with a depth of over 200 feet was now a saltwater lake with a depth almost double its original. And with this event, the biological balance of the ecosystem was completely changed. Saltwater life where there was once freshwater life. Now, I know you already know the answer to the question that I'm about to ask. Was there any measurable effect to the climate when such a complete reversal of an ecosystem took place? Well, of course, the answer is no. We can confirm this through observations of the lack of change in the climate data recorded in Louisiana from 1980 till now. This is no small observation when placed in the context of climate change. And because I don't want you thinking I'm cherry picking my events, I'm going to provide even more observable data for your viewing pleasure. But I want to move this discussion to the 3D realm. That way you can't accuse me of just showing surface changes. That's right, we're going vertical, Mav. Since we're going to look at this from a 3D perspective, we have to talk about what makes a climate. Again, I want to remind you that up to this point in the political discussion of climate change, not a single scientist has ever discussed what the climates are and what makes a climate. You're going to hear it first here tonight. I told you at the top of this episode, we are going to science the heck out of this topic. And so now let's discuss what it takes to actually make a climate. All a climate is the symbiotic relationship between the geological makeup of a vast area and the weather that enters it. That is all that makes up a climate. These areas are so vast that there are only 5 recognized climates by NOAA. That is the vastness that we're talking about. Because of this relationship, it is climates that affect plants, control the nature of soil, and determine an animal's survivability. Now, wait a second, Michael. Scientists are telling me that I'm the one that affects climate. You're just flat out wrong, Mr. McMurray. Well, my response is your powers of observation do not fail you. This is what scientists have been telling you. But it is also scientists that have provided the definition of climates and its effects on the environment that I just read to you. That definition came directly out of a high school biology book written by a scientist. If you have a child that is currently taking high school biology, go get their book and look it up. And look up those sections on ecosystems and biomes and tell me I'm wrong. Will you now recognize the glaring scientific contradiction in the presentation of climate change? No, not yet. That's okay. I got more to share. The examples I'm about to give show how we as humans have zero effect on the climate. That's right. I said zero effect. The first example I'm going to give is another recent one, and that's the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. We as humans failed to care for the land. A new ecosystem was developing because of the lack of care for the soil farmers took in planting crops. Remember back to that definition of climates and its effects? What affects the soil? Well, it's the climate. And since the ecosystem has no effect on the climate, the soil was able to rebound in just 6 years. Yes, man did affect the ecosystem, but with just a little effort and time, the soil rebounded, and again, the climate of the vast region remained the same. Yes, man did begin crop rotations and add nutrients back to the ground, but the climate in the interim didn't change, because the climate affects the soil and not the other way around. This is observable proof that the definition given by scientists about climates in those high school biology books is the correct definition. The next example I'm going to give is by far the most explosive to the idea that climate change is real. This example being that of the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These are my 3D examples. These two bombs dropped killed approximately 200,000 people, separated atoms in the atmosphere, leveled buildings and infrastructure, consumed vegetation, destroyed livestock, and did so at the atomic level. And this is the death blow to the argument for climate change, something they have no answer for, because the effects of these two explosions stretched from the surface to 60,000 feet, which was the height of the mushroom cloud. And the same climate that existed in Japan in 1945 is still the same climate that they experience today. At no point in time in human history have humans ever demonstrated we have the authority to change climates. Climates develop over too vast an area for us to affect them. Yes, we can affect an ecosystem, but we don't have the authority to change a climate. These examples I gave are observable, repeatable, and measurable proof of the stability of climates due to the relationship between the vast geological construction and weather of that area. Areas so big that there are only 5 climates over the entire Earth. The only way we as humans can affect climate is to reshape the world's geological makeup and layout. Literally move mountains from one area of the Earth to an area where no mountains existed. That is literally what it is going to take. And since there are no bids for corporations to move the Alps to the Amazon, I believe we are safe from the effects of climate change. Now, if I haven't lost you already, I may lose you here. But that's okay, because I'm still going to share the truth. And the truth is this: God has established the laws of nature. He has given us authority to operate within those laws. He has also placed limits on us as it pertains to natural law. This is evident in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. Here God tells us exactly what we have authority over. He enumerates our control. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. You see, we only have the authority to affect our ecosystem. This is declared by God, validated in science, and proved by the evidence of our previous behavior. This sentiment is reinforced in Matthew chapter 7, verse 20. And Jesus said unto them, Because of your unbelief, for verily I say unto you, if ye have faith as a grain of mustard seed, ye shall say to this mountain, Remove hence to yonder place, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible for you. If we had the authority to move mountains by mechanical effort, Christ would have had no reason to make this statement. He would have told them to go get a bulldozer. This is again God declaring the supernatural power it would take to affect climate. Again, God set natural law, enumerated our authority over it, and then defined our scope. Look, I know I'm fighting an uphill battle here. Many of my own friends have cautioned me not even to air this episode. But I'm sorry. I will not let fear be a factor that drives my decision making. These are scientific facts that I discussed here tonight. And what makes me more angry than anything else is that I was betrayed by the ones I trusted. I trusted those scientists, and they took my trust and betrayed it by willfully omitting the science that proves climate change is a complete and utter hoax. So why perpetuate this hoax? What would be their motivation? Well, the answer is a simple one. Since 1993, over $153 billion has been spent here in America alone on climate change research. That would be hard to resist the temptation to give up billions of dollars when all you have to do is simply omit the truth. So the answer is a simple one. It is greed. The scientific community has allowed their love of money to manipulate its science. What proves this is the fact that every biology book sitting in American classrooms today confirms the evidence I spoke of here tonight. All of them do. Climate changers ignore the science that they're teaching to kids for the sake of billions of dollars available to conduct research on an event they know will never take place, an event they know is scientifically impossible to occur. They have lied about the science for the sake of money. Those are the facts, the scientific ones. So there you have it, America. The truth behind the agenda of the climate change lies. Again, I will say it. I am not a climate change denier. I reject it altogether as a hoax designed to defraud the American people out of hundreds of billions of dollars. The question now becomes, do we, as a nation, have the courage to hold those liars accountable? I know I do. That's why I'm broadcasting this episode, to reverse the trends of more failed policy by government officials and now scientists with this failed agenda. Below is proposed legislation, the Prevention of Funding for Climate Change Research Act. This bill prevents Congress from allocating tax dollars for research into the failed science of climate change. This is not a bill preventing private institutions from conducting further research. It's simply going to prevent American tax dollars from being spent on it. It's that easy. Are you tired of being conned by elitist politicians and scientists lying to you to create fear and panic just to rob you of your hard-earned money? Heck, I am. Click the link below and forward this bill to your representative and let them know we are sick and tired of being lied to and stolen from. Once again, America, we are given a chance to reverse the trends of failed socialist government practices. I would ask that if passing legislation that strengthens our economy and protects Americans' rights is what you love about this country, then please hit that subscribe button, tap that bell icon, and give us a thumbs up to show your support for real conservative values. Thank you again for your continued support of what we are doing here at the First Branch. We are humbled and blessed by the outpouring of your support. Have a great weekend, America, and God bless.